your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, I'm Jeanette Roche. Thanks for joining us for a look at what's been making headlines in Alberta. Residents of the town of Jasper, Alberta returned home over the past week after a massive wildfire forced them from their homes 4 weeks ago. When Alice Fober entered her home for the first time since a wildfire torched her town, the rancid smell from her fridge made it difficult to recognize where she was. Fober was among dozens of residents who had a chance to assess the gray rubble left behind by a wildfire that destroyed a third of the town's structures.
It was really hard driving up and seeing the burnt trees and that are pretty much like toothpicks at this point. But it was nice to see the firemen and the support workers that greeted us at the gates and had welcomed us into the town. You know, they were very kind to us. They were very delicate with us, very sympathetic. It feels like you kind of lost part of Jasper's soul. You know, there's so many residential houses that are gone, neighborhoods that are gone, places that I had, long boarded through that are just ash.
The blaze destroyed more than 300 buildings, which equated to around 800 housing units, or 30% of all structures in Jasper. Fire departments from all over the province joined forces to win the battle against the fire in the town area, including the members of Sterling, Alberta's fire department. One member with the fire department talks about his experience from the moment they were called July 24th until his return 7 days after the fire.
Fairly chaotic to start off. You get into the fire hall, so we were looking through the unburnt parts of town for any burning embers, anything on fire, essentially making sure the fire didn't reach any further into the town than it already was. I have 3 young children, so I've seen quite a bit of kids' toys and some parts of burnt books and whatnot, like kids' books from houses, so that was probably the saddest part, I'd say, out of it, for me anyways.
In other news, rail workers took to the picket lines across Canada Thursday after our country's 2 major railways failed to reach an agreement with their workers' union. However, Canada's Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon stepped in 16 hours later to refer the dispute to the board to impose binding arbitration.
These collective bargaining negotiations belong to these parties, but their effects and the impacts of the current impasse are being borne by all Canadians. And there is an impasse. As Minister of Labour, I am using my authorities under the Canada Labour Code to secure industrial peace and deliver the short and long-term solutions that are in the national interest.
And while Canadian National Railway workers returned to work Friday after the historic rail stoppage, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC, met again with the Canada Industrial Relations Board and the Teamsters Union. The railway said it was prepared to discuss the resumption of service at the meeting, but the union refuses, saying that they are unhappy with the federal government's decision to step in and want to make submissions to challenge the constitutionality of Ottawa's direction. On Thursday, the day of the lockout, the Teamsters 750 union showed up at the Kip Yard outside of the town of Colehurst, Alberta, to advocate for a return to work with new working conditions. One of the members explains what some of their working conditions have been like.
The CP has issued a lockout 13 days before we were actually to go on strike. And at no point have they come to the table and bargained fairly with us. So we're looking for a better quality of life where CPs wants to run us, work us longer and pay us less. We spend hours away from home, could be 24 to 36 to 48 hours away from home every trip, and CP wants to add to that. I just appreciate all the turnout we have today, and it's it's united we stand. So.
And last week, prior to the lockout, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith discussed how each day rail workers aren't working will have devastating effects on the country.
The 8-day strike in 2019 ended up costing $3 billion. And when you have a day's worth of delay, it can result in several days worth of recovery to be able to catch up We also know that the longer it's closed, the more it's going to shut down businesses because you can't produce products just in time if you can't get them onto freight to be able to transport it.
After the break, we inspect Alberta's Heritage Savings Trust Fund, which was established to save money for the future of the province if needed. The problem is there aren't as many dollars saved as there should be. Stay with us for an insightful discussion about the differences between Alberta's dwindling savings fund and Alaska's flourishing one, and what we might learn from that northerly state. The Alberta Heritage Fund was established by Premier Peter Lougheed in 1976 in hopes of saving for the future. But in lean economic times, governments have taken money out of the fund. Tegan Hill, who is the director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute and co-author of a study called An Alberta Dividend, the Key to Growing the Heritage Fund, looked at Alaska's permanent fund. She says the success they've had in growing the fund allows them to give dividends to residents every year. The question is, can Alberta do the same?
Well, the Alberta government has committed to growing the Heritage Fund to between $250 to $400 billion by 2050. That's a worthy goal, but we know based on the history of the Heritage Fund that governments have a really hard time sticking to that commitment. So what we've done in this study is actually look to Alaska. They've had a lot more success growing their fund, and part of that comes from using a dividend.
Yeah, right. So how much money do we have currently in our fund?
We're maybe 23 billion projected for this year, somewhere around that. For context, well, let's use the same year. So when we looked at the data in the report, up to 2022-23, the latest year of comparable data, the Alaska Fund was worth $78 billion in US. That's about $90 billion in Canadian. And again, that same year, we were at about 20 billion. So they've had a lot more success at growing their fund than we have here in Alberta.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So your study obviously looks at the success that Alaska has had with its resource revenue savings fund, and you're suggesting that we could do something similar here in Alberta. So how large is the Alaskan fund now? You kind of just sort of mentioned it there, and how much of a dividend are Alaskan residents typically receiving annually from that amount?
Right. So again, let's talk USD. So we're looking at a $78 billion fund. The fund has paid over $30 billion to Alaskans since its inception, actually, which was the same year. It started the same year as Alberta in 1976. And on average, in inflation adjusted terms, Alaskan residents are receiving a $1,900 dividend annually.
Wow. So how does Alaska do things? Like, do they have a mandatory percentage of oil revenue that the government is required to deposit into the savings fund no matter what?
Yeah, so since inception, they have had a constitutional rule that 25% of resource revenues have to be saved in their fund. They also have a rule that the fund has to be inflation proofed annually.
Do you know if the province has looked into sort of adopting some of those methods that the Alaskan government has been doing?
I know that it's been considered in an academic realm. I know that, we're not the first to look at Alaska as an example. From this current Alberta government, I have not heard any conversation about dividends. We know again that Smith has committed to growing the fund to $250 to $400 billion by 2050, but she's not going to be our premier until 2050.
Right.
That's why we need robust rules that ensure when the governments change, or even if, let's say, resource revenue declined in a year and the Smith government thought, oh no, we need more money for the budget. We need rules to make sure that that can't happen. You need to stick to those fiscal rules, and it will impose discipline on governments as well, which is really important because we don't have a lot of spending discipline for governments today. And that's a separate but very related issue. And the Heritage Fund could help with that.
Yeah. Okay. So if I understand correctly, the Alaska government does retain the authority to reduce or even eliminate the dividends for its citizens. However, it's interesting to note that it's never done this in over 40 years. So what does that tell us?
it tells us that there's a lot of political pressure to maintain that dividend, and that dividend is linked to the growth and success of the fund. So it tells us that that dividend is really, really key. And again, I think a lot of Albertans are familiar with the Heritage Fund, but they don't keep tabs on, is it 20 billion, is it 40 billion, is it X, Y, and Z, because they don't see each year what that fund is looking like. This dividend is going to tie the performance of the fund to people individually, and as rational individuals, you want a bigger dividend than a smaller one, especially right now when so many people are struggling with affordability. I think introducing this dividend, it could be very impactful at this time when I think people are paying even more attention to their pocketbooks. It could be a huge success in Alberta.
From the Alberta Heritage Fund to its Bill of Rights, up next, we look at what Premier Smith is doing to strengthen it. That's next. Keep it right here. Welcome back. Well, there's been talk that Premier Danielle Smith intends to strengthen Alberta's Bill of Rights this fall. Legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, says changes would fulfill campaign promises by Premier Smith, but the alteration of a constitutional document would pose some political challenges as well. Here is part of that interview with BCN's Hal Roberts.
It's a weird situation, right? Because we have the Bill of Rights, which, as you said, is from 1972, and then we have the Charter from 1982, and the Charter really supersedes sort of all these other things. I believe BC has sort of a written constitution, but it's just sort of a little bit of uncharted territory in some ways. Can you have a provincial constitution when you've also got a federal one? How do the courts interpret this? Nobody's striking down legislation. No judges are striking down legislation on the basis of the Bill of Rights, really. They look to the Charter and the Constitution Act. So I think it's fair to say that this is legally sort of a weird sort of area, an unclear sort of area. But politically, I think that's the case as well. I mean, the things that are looking to be added to the Bill of Rights, as you mentioned, sort of freedom from medical discrimination, I think is the way they're phrasing it. Maybe that's on the less controversial end, but if we're talking about the right to keep and bear arms, that's going to be significantly more controversial in, I think, large parts of the province. So there's the political challenge there of, how do you sell to someone in downtown Calgary or Edmonton or Lethbridge the idea that people should be allowed to bear arms, or the idea that people should be allowed to use, some degree of weapons against someone who's on their property, right? So this is, I think, probably a tough political sell, and you have to imagine that the NDP is pretty happy to have that fight, pretty happy to argue against a right to bear arms on city streets and things like that. So it's and then the other part of it, which is, it's not really an issue yet, but let's say this becomes, a genuine conversation, a genuine province-wide conversation about what an Alberta constitution should look like. I mean, people of a certain age are going to remember that from the Charlottetown Accords and the Meech Lake Accords, what that conversation looked like across the entire country. What degree of similar intensity would need to be had in Alberta to have that conversation? Is this something that a group of people within the United Conservative Party can push for, that the United Conservative Party can create legislation or update legislation based off of, or is there going to need to be some sort of province-wide, society-wide discussion on what an Alberta constitution ought to look like? That's not a question I think that has been answered yet, or maybe even considered, but I think certainly is a relevant one. If the NDP were in power, right, and said, oh, we're going to update the Bill of Rights with, a bunch of progressive ideas, you'd have to think that the United Conservatives wouldn't be totally chuffed about that idea, and a lot of conservative-leaning Albertans wouldn't either. So I do think it's a really interesting question, of course. Should there be different rights, more rights, better protections for XYZ in Alberta? But, what does that conversation look like? So it's going to be really interesting. I'm fascinated by this, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's see how it all shakes down. Now, Premier Danielle Smith has a leadership review coming up at the next UCP convention, Tyler. Now, you say there's been some frustration from more of her right-leaning base that she's not pushed hard enough on some of the COVID-era questions. Can you explain?
Yeah, well, I mean, she was sort of pushed into the premier's chair or lifted into the premier's chair by people who are really dissatisfied with the sort of COVID era of Alberta politics. You know, the vaccine mandates, the way the Coots border blockades were handled, the charges, the public health charges that were laid against, various pastors and business owners and so on and so forth. And Smith ended up having to back off some of the promises that she made to those people, quite early on in her tenure. She promised, for example, some amnesty from COVID charges, which was something she couldn't really do because a lot of that, rests with the Crown and not politicians and things like that. So there is, I think, a little bit of frustration that she has moved towards the middle, shall we say, on a lot of the issues that a lot of the people who really supported her care about. Now, does that materialize in a really close vote at the convention in November? I don't really think so. And I think, as I was talking about with Jeanette the other week, you also don't see sort of disunity within her caucus, which you did see with Jason Kenney. We're mainly talking about some sort of grassroots frustration about some of the things that have been done. Another good example is the income tax cut that was promised and then didn't materialize in this year's budget. So I do think there's some dissatisfaction, probably among some different factions of the party's base. But, in some of the things that we're talking about right now, the Bill of Rights stuff, for example, this, I think, is a fairly clear sort of cookie to some of her longer term supporters who she's going to want on her side coming into the leadership review.
We do need to take a short break, but when we return, the first day of school is just around the corner, and that means a province-wide cell phone ban. Plus, will the Premier implement her pronoun policy? That discussion next. Well, September is just around the corner, and that means getting the kids ready for back to school. But one thing that won't be allowed back in class this upcoming school year is cell phones. We continue now with Hell's discussion with legislative correspondent Tyler Dawson about what this upcoming school year could look like with some of the changes the Premier is implementing.
The school boards have until basically the new year to develop their own sort of take on that policy, what that sort of enforcement or rules might sort of look like. So, I think some of the bigger school boards have got those policies in place already. There's other jurisdictions that have done this, so it's not, particularly hard to just crib from their policy proposals to make it happen. But yeah, certainly some students are not going to be allowed to be on their phones with their headphones in, texting on their iPads, or do kids even use iPads? I don't know, when they're in class. So it's, and I was reading about this yesterday because I wrote a little something about it. And there's some pretty good evidence, actually, that being distracted by digital devices has academic consequences, which is perfect common sense, of course. If you're on your phone during math class, like, of course, your math scores are going to suffer. But they really vary by efficacy depending on how they're set up, how they're enforced, whether teachers are, studiously enforcing them, all that kind of thing. So I do think that some of these sort of variety of policies we're going to end up with, might not be quite as effective, say, as a consistent policy across the board. And the other finding, the OECD did a bunch of research on this a couple of years ago, and what they found basically is that if these policies are too stringent, if kids aren't having any time on their phones during the day, they actually end up staying late on their phones when they're supposed to be going to bed, which it does make me think of when the new Harry Potter book came out, and of course everyone was dog tired the next day because they've been up all night reading. So there's a little bit of parenting, I think, that needs to come along with this to make sure that it all kind of works out. It's not just those school hours on the phone that make a difference here.
It's funny you talk about math grades. My math grade suffered. I didn't even have a cell phone.
Yeah, well, mine too.
That's why we're both media. That's why we're journalists.
Exactly.
Yeah, not mathematicians. Now, Tyler, it sounds like Danielle Smith's pronoun policies in schools will not be ready in time for the start of the school year. She said that legislation would come out in the fall, but we really don't know what it may look like, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think it was probably clear that they weren't going to have this ready by September 1st, by the time everyone was back in class, just because they hadn't introduced legislation in the spring sitting, and the legislature's been on break all summer. So they do really need to be back in the office, so to speak, before there's any sort of legislative or regulatory movement on this. But you're right, we don't know what it's going to look like. We have the announcement that Premier Smith made back in January, and I think we've got the broad strokes ideas of what they're looking to achieve. We don't know, I think, mainly what some of the, say, wiggle room changes might be. Are there going to be some, I mean, for example, the pronoun thing is if you're under the age of 16, you need parental consent to change your pronouns at school. Well, is there going to be some sort of clause in the legislation or the regulations that says, well, if the student says, they're in danger at home, if their parents are told, might there be some wiggle room there? And the reason I think that sort of flexibility is going to be important is it really would just maybe change what happens when this ends up in court, because it's almost certainly going to end up in court, as the case in Saskatchewan did. And that, of course, raises the question of whether or not the notwithstanding clause will end up being used. So we just don't know the specifics. We know the broad strokes. We don't know the specifics. And of course, this is going to be wildly controversial when it happens, regardless of what is actually what those policies end up looking like.
Harvest season has begun. In many parts of the province, the harvest has been actually better than previous years. And there were a lot of concerns, like you and I talked about this before, that the dry winter we had last winter would have a negative impact on crops. But thanks to some spring and summer rains, some farmers have enjoyed a pretty good growing season.
Yeah, it seems to have been not bad. I think about 25% better yields sort of on average across the board is what the Alberta government's saying at this point. As you say, there were lots of rains in the spring, which really helped for seeding and early season farming. But then it was a very hot, dry summer in parts of the province for good chunks of the last couple months. So yeah, harvests are looking better. To go back to the math thing, this is a bit of a math problem. Better than average, but of course the average has gone down in the last few years because there's been so many bad harvests. So it's better than average, but that average has slid over the last 5 or so years as well. But either way, I think for the province's farmers, this is sort of unambiguous good news and hopefully a sign that this sort of long-term drought situation that we're in is maybe slowly improving.
After the break, I put on my cowgirl hat and join you from the Lethbridge and District Exhibition, where our annual summer rodeo and fair is happening through Saturday night. We'll be right back to Whoop It Up. Well, it is summertime in Lethbridge when Whoop Up Days is on, and that is exactly where I'm standing right now. It's an event that we've been waiting for all summer long. The festivities kicked off early Tuesday morning with a parade, and as BCN's Naveen Day reports, the horses, the floats, and the displays were all out in full force, along with one very special animal you don't normally see in a parade. Take a look.
For Lethbridge, this is the greatest thing that's happened this year.
Well, if you live in Lethbridge, there are 3 words you've been hearing a lot lately. Those 3 words, Whoop Up Days. And to kick off the event was the Whoop Up Days parade held on Tuesday morning. Before the parade kicked off, I had a chance to chat with this year's parade marshal, Dwayne Kessler.
I've been a part of the Lethbridge exhibition for over 50 years, and for them to think of me in such a capacity is, like I said, very overwhelming.
Here are some highlights from Tuesday morning's parade. While the floats are always a hit with the spectators, they shared with me what they really look forward to.
I love the horses.
The horses. Can't beat the horses.
Horses. Horses and pretty ladies. Come on now.
And while there were an abundance of horses to be seen, there was one animal that stole the show. Check out this bison. It was also a chance for local clubs to show off their skills. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
Now, if you are planning on coming out for the final day of festivities here at Whoop Up Days, there is no shortage of attraction for everyone. And BCN's Landon Hickok got to check out most of what there was to offer and has more from the Lethbridge and District exhibition.
We're here at the Lethbridge and District exhibition grounds, and I can say that the party is underway here at Whoop Up Days. And you can see there's a lot of different festivities that this festival provides, including many different types of rides. There is a swing ride that you can hear a lot of terrified people screaming. There's a lot of games where people can win prizes off of. There's a lot of different food stands. Earlier I had the chance to go inside the district building where they have wildlife, including different snakes and reptiles. There's a porcupine there I thought was really adorable. They have a marketplace where they usually host the farmers market every Saturday morning. What's your favorite part of the festival so far?
Probably, I'd either say the zipper or the vertigo.
What are you most looking forward to?
Probably that new ride over there called the Speed.
I like to go on the Rockstar one.
Are you looking forward to anything else?
Probably eating mini donuts.
How you guys liking the festival so far?
So funny.
Having fun.
Having fun. Super fun. Like, we're so excited about the festival.
Right, they're so exciting.
I'm
from the Philippines.
Yeah.
The Philippines?
Yeah. First time going to Whoop Up.
You guys try any good food here?
Yeah, Georgina's. We tried the Filipino food truck. It was good.
Filipino food truck? What kind of food did you get?
It is like chicken barbecue and pork barbecue.
Got it. Now, it cannot be Whoop Up Days without the various food and drink options found around the festival. I got a mango Graham Delight, as it's called, from one of the food trucks in the festival. It's supposed to consist of ripe mango, caramel, sweetened cream. You know, the one thing about these drinks I really appreciate is that they're not too sweet. They're sweet just enough they can absorb all the natural flavors from the mango and the sweetened cream, and it's just so smooth and it's just a delight. I think this is going to be one of the best drinks in the festival. That's just my opinion. I'm not a food reviewist, I'm just the news. So there are many different features around Whoop Up Days, ranging from games and rides and entertainment. So if you haven't come down yet already, you got all week to do so until Saturday, until midnight each one of those days. We all have it covered here on Bridge City News.
Well, I'm about to break out of here and get on one of these rides, but before I check that out, coming up after the break, there are some who are very much against coal mining in the Rockies and others who are supportive of it. So coming up, we hear from a couple who are with citizens supportive of Crow's Nest coal. Keep it right here.